In something of an uncommon response, I am going to do a follow-up on the submission I made earlier today, having to do with our old pal, No Name McCain. And it is what I attempted to do, and I think I largely succeeded, was to be even-handed in discussing some of the things which are not true about things that he allegedly did, most particularly the hot dogging scene, the flame-out scene on the Forrestal. Apparently, he did not do. And I want to be clear about that. But I don't want to be any better to him than that. Obviously, if it is purely a false report, and apparently there are many, many of you who believe that it is a true statement that he was the one. The outlines, however, say that he was on the opposite side of the aircraft carrier, that the back of his airplane was hanging out over the aircraft, over the outside edge of the aircraft carrier. So even if he had flashed the flames, it would not have shown, and that the source of the problem, the rocket, came from the opposite side of the aircraft carrier. But be that as it may, that's neither here nor there. I also received, it's funny but it's not funny, somebody was, when I mentioned in this last one that I had called him JockStrap McStain, the person, when I mentioned that I had basically stopped doing it because it was disrespectful, and this person said yes, it was disrespectful, and went on to point out that basically I was a stain on the family, that my mother was basically someone that was having a period, and my dad was somebody who had splooched semen, and that that was all that there was of me because I was such a disrespectful person. And needless to say, I erased the person's notes and removed them from making further comments. So what I'm going to do then is say what I really mean, okay? And it doesn't mean that I was being disingenuous in the previous one. I was attempting to be even-handed, at least historically as it relates to McCain. And part of the reason that I did that is that going back 2 decades, I thought that he was in fact some form of genuine maverick, and that he was certainly not of the timber of Barry Goldwater, certainly not of the timber of Barry Goldwater, but that he at least stood his own as it relates to representing the state of Arizona. And as a Montanan, I was pleased that there was a maverick there that was going to balance things out, was serve as the middle of the Senate, and cut down on the polarity. So I gave him the benefit of the doubt. But in retrospect, when we look at it, and this is part of what I tried to say at the end of my report, when did he turn dark? Because he obviously turned dark, and I'm going to go through some of the things that indicate it, and I'm going to lay most heavily upon the tail end of it, and then perhaps tie it in with Q. But the first one is, you know, as a pilot, I mean, he obviously conducted himself badly, and most greenhorn pilots in a trainer plane that ditched a trainer and claimed that it flamed out might be cut slack the first time. Most of them who hot dogged it a second time and tore down a power line, a huge power line that impacted tens of thousands of Spaniards and caused them to lose their power, and thereby damaging the plane as well, and not paying attention. I mean, he made some kind of offhand comment about, too bad that you know, I caused some people to lose their power, but that's not it. I mean, he caused tens of thousands of dollars of damage, if not much, much more, to the Spaniards, and to their time and replacement of stuff. He also put a $250,000, $500,000 airplane in serious jeopardy and obviously caused damage to it. You don't hit a power line and have that stuff strapped over your wing when you land on the aircraft carrier and not cause damage. And then the third one, of course, is that he ditched a plane that he had used for his own personal use and claimed that it had flamed out while he was returning with gifts for his kids in Virginia. And that was all before the Hanoi, the North Vietnamese thing. Most pilots in that early training, pre-battle mode would have been washed out, reprimanded, or removed for the misconduct that he did, most of them at the very least. And he caused, I'm guessing $500,000 to $1 million worth of damage in those 3 planes. So are they accidents? Well, something might be an accident, but they weren't all accidents. And there was pilot error noted in obviously the hot dog event in Spain was pilot error. Number 2, the landing that he did in Virginia when he was borrowing an airplane for a weekend off, they noted that the damage that supposedly happened to the jet engine probably didn't happen, and that he had made several poor decisions, including not switching the power, choosing the proper emergency landing, exiting the airplane too late, etc. So he made at least 3 mistakes in that, and of course the first one was with the trainer, and he claimed that it flamed out and that he had to jettison it. So, but those are little things. I mean, those are mistakes, but they're little things. They involve him and money. They don't involve anybody else. Then we've got the Keating savings and loan thing and the influence peddling and the trading for his Senate seat for hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of value that his wife and father-in-law had in investment with Keating, and backing that up. And of course he got reprimanded, and he can kind of consider that his blot on his life. But that one does not count, it does not measure in any sense with the time that he spent in Vietnam. And I've had many postings on today from Vietnam veterans, from people who personally knew MIAs and POWs, and that none of those guys coughed up. None of those guys confessed. None of those guys gave secret information. McCain readily admitted that he had done so and that he was ashamed of himself, but he was most ashamed of the fact that his father was going to find out, and apparently his father found out long before McCain ever returned, and that they didn't talk about it much, which is not surprising. Then you have him interfering in international affairs, which is at best a serious crime and a violation of the fundamental principles of the separation of powers between the administration and Congress. Congress is not ever supposed to hold themselves out as an international emissary. They're not supposed to engage in negotiations. They're not supposed to interact with any of the other powers or cabinet people or leaders of other countries. That's left to the executive branch. And yet McCain has repeatedly done so, as has Obama since he's gotten out of office, and perhaps Clinton on an off and on basis, and who knows what Hillary's done. But he is also seen as having been in and out of the Ukraine and dealt with the moguls and the oligarchs in both Ukraine and in Russia, seen coming and going in Oleg Deripaska's yacht and elsewhere. This stuff's all pretty dark stuff. It links to Soros. It links to other nefarious characters. It puts a cross line in with the Russians, which of course is what he's blaming Trump for. And then of course he's involved in the dossier, which is political intrigue, it's collusion, it's meddling in an election, it is criminal behavior, it is giving false information, which is also a crime to the FBI and others. He disseminated it and held it up as fact or as something upon which they should rely, and apparently was involved either early on in it or was a transporting intermediary. But it again is criminal behavior, and if anybody colluded and meddled in our election that can be pointed to besides Hillary Clinton, it is John McCain, who had no business being where he was. Then you've got him aiding the enemy, and this is something Q has pointed out, and it is a huge thing. It shows him engaging in our enemy who is the Syrian ISIS bunch. Those guys were all identified. The pictures that Q shared with us are, they're clearly not fabricated pictures. There are multiples of him sitting down, meeting with them, of being outside, of being at the buildings, of being at other places. It is clear that he is colluding with the enemy and is creating more trouble for us. And on top of that, you've got the un-American activity that he engaged in, and some others have pointed this out to me. Farmer Jones and others have sent this to me, a write-up based on a book of a 10-point issue, a 10-point deal, which involves both McCain. McCain as prominently as anybody in attempting to hide the evidence of or existence of MIAs and POWs that were left in Vietnam after the war. And it is a most nefarious situation, because what it means is that we knew that there were more prisoners there. What happened in the negotiations with Vietnam when we were in France and we were negotiating on it is that they disclosed something to the effect that they had 500 or so prisoners. We thought that was outrageously low, and of course it was. And then we went from there to knowing some other facts, which of course nobody wanted to tell us. And this guy that wrote the book, I'm going to see if I can find it, War Hero Candidate Buried, blah, 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 and this is by Sidney Schonberg, and it goes into all of the things which have to do, I'll clip this on so you can look at it, but there is a mass of evidence, as it points out, that there were POWs and MIAs probably left in Vietnam that were used as that the Vietnamese were going to use as trading stock for us, giving them reparations at the end of the war. And we were supposed to hand over $1 billion or whatever it is, $3.25 billion. Nixon was pledged to hand over. But he also, in his classic Tricky Dicky Nixon, and remember who was negotiating this, Henry Kissinger, that they used doublespeak to hide the fact that they had no intention of paying that money, and they could probably never have gotten it through Congress. So what they did is they left those MIAs and POWs on the table. They left them there, and knowing full well that if they didn't pay up, they were never going to see them. And so basically this has been hidden ever since. And there were families of these POWs that came to Congress repeatedly and asked for disclosure. There were truth bills that were proposed that got squashed, and then McCain proposed legislation which basically would hide forever the information that we as Americans had about these missing POWs, and basically helped hide them. And so we've got Nixon and Kissinger and others and all of the administration since that knew exactly what was going on. And then you've got supposedly Reagan was going to pull the trigger and we were going to go in and rescue some, and nothing ever happened. They called that off twice, and I can't tell exactly how that was. And finally this guy that writes this says, here is evidence that these guys have been left behind, and he goes through that there were 591 prisoners identified by the Vietnamese, and I want to drop down, I'm going to skip There were some firsthand sightings. There were witnesses that said there were other prisoners. There were people, POWs, that were released that said there were live prisoners that they had left behind. There were some that said that they hadn't gotten out. There was stuff from Laos and Cambodia and from Thai investigators that had high-tech equipment. There's evidence that there were signs left for aerial reconnaissance, showing that these guys had actually made signs saying that they were there. And there was, and this is, I think, perhaps most telling and very important, is that when Soviet Union dropped out, like everything else, and we've discussed that in other senses, especially about the fact that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had 300 insider communist spies spying on us during the Second World War and before then, and that they were collaborating with FDR and our administration to the advantage of the Soviet Union. But in addition to that, and this is really important, when this stuff broke loose, it was obvious that we found, and that was released, and let me see if I can find this, in 1993, after the crash of the Soviet Union, they found a Hanoi Politburo that from a message internal between Hanoi, North Vietnam, and the Soviet Union, that there were 1,205 prisoners being held, and that those 1,205 prisoners were there. This was in '93. This is 20 years after this Vietnam thing wound down, and that these guys were getting moved back and forth, and what our government did, and McCain helped with, was to deny this stuff and to treat it as disingenuous information, inaccurate information, and they blew it off. So in composite, McCain, who was a POW, not only abandoned some of his POWs, not only committed treasonous acts, violated his military oath, and colluded with, or at least gave information to the North Vietnamese when he was a POW, but when he left, he didn't look after anybody that was still there, and he did a number of things on a long-term basis to help hide the fact that there were others in his like circumstance who had in fact been left behind, and that we were not going to make any attempt to either negotiate for or to save. Now, some of you have pointed out, and I'm going to give this one more piece to this. Some of you have pointed out that, you know, here he had these two four-star admiral parents, or parent and grandparent, and that he had besmirched the family. Well, let me tell you that that may not be entirely true. And part of the reason I say that is that if you haven't followed up on the USS Liberty, then you don't know the whole story. And the USS Liberty fits into everything else we've talked about. This is the collusion that goes on between Israel and the United States, and this, instead of FDR, has to do with LBJ. And basically it is this, that we had this intelligence ship off the coast of Israel, out in the straits there, and it and it was there for intelligence purposes. This is during the Syrian battle with the Israelis in '67, and suddenly this ship is being attacked by unmarked airplanes, unmarked jets, and they napalm it, they strafe bomb it, they disconnected and interfered with the radio communications, and they just kept coming back and forth. If you've watched the documentary on this, these guys just played with this ship and basically totally disabled. Then submarines showed up that had the six-pointed Israeli star, and they started torpedoing and strafing it as well. And they torpedoed it, killing 25, I think 25 guys immediately that were below decks. And this thing is limping along, taking in water, and these guys heroically, these guys on the Liberty, heroically, they send out a message. The message goes to the 2 aircraft carriers that are supposed to scramble jets and ward these guys off, because we're obviously being attacked. And they get called off. They get called off. And McNamara and LBJ apparently are right in the middle of it and actually know about the condition of the Liberty and call it off. Well, these guys managed to string a phony antenna up that got them communication with the other American ships a second time and said we're still being attacked. And they finally got the message in. Well, these guys, the senior brass for the Navy, overrode or didn't request permission from our administration, and they were going to send jets out. And as soon as that was relayed by the radio, the Israelis got all their ships and airplanes out of there. So there were helicopters and jets and submarines, and they were all Israelis. And so why is this relevant to John McCain? Well, it's more relevant to LBJ and to McNamara, and it's more relevant to the collusive, terrible things that are going on internationally in our country, and having to do with how we are being sold out, and we're being sold out to the benefit of others, including those who back Israel. But who is the admiral in charge in this? And it is John S. McCain Jr. John McCain's, the senator's, JockStrap's dad. And he's right in the chain of command on this thing. He orders an investigation. He gives them 1 week to provide a report, and then actually the source of the information is quashed, so they can't even give a report. And then they swear everybody that survived this to never talk about it again. They were given orders not to talk about it again. So we had something like 75% casualty on this ship. 175 or 200 of them are dead or injured, and a few of them, another 35 or 40, my numbers are not perfect, survive it. But of course they're all traumatized, and they probably all had PTSD. But on top of that, you've got these collusive, multi-generational animals in the middle of our government that are willing to trade truth, trade honesty, trade for treason, trade for collusion, trade for sedition, trade for money laundering and pay for play, and political intrigue, un-American activities, leaving our soldiers and sailors to rot and to be executed by our former enemy. And all of that's going on, and McCain's in on it, and so is his dad, and of course so is LBJ, and it goes on for generations. So it is another piece of the nasty collusion and dark, deep state that has been going on. That happened in '67. Hey folks, that's 51 years ago. And if you think anything has changed in the last 51 years, you're right. It did change. It changed for the worst. And we need to clean it up. So the Q stuff that has pointed out that McCain was in on this and through this process is very accurate, and it is not peculiar, and it is not anecdotal, and it is not incongruent with the rest of the stuff that's going on. Now, let me add one more piece to that, that not only do we have to clean it up, many of you have pointed out that perhaps McCain is not dead. It is odd and anomalous, first of all, that Q would predict it to the day or within a day or so. If you read the cryptic stuff, if you read the Nostradamuc impetus of Q's reporting since last October, McCain has been in the target, and No Name has been in the target, and there has been a drumbeat of him going, leaving, being taken out. So that's been ongoing for a long time. Secondly, the fact that he announces on one day he's not going to get any more chemical or radiation treatment, and the next day he dies, within hours he dies. Is that likely? No, it's not. I mean, if you were going to announce that you were going to quit getting treatment, you would do that when you had 6 or 8 weeks left. Otherwise, why would you bother? I mean, why wouldn't you just pass on? So that doesn't make any sense. But let me add to this. Not only has he left the scene in the last few days, but we've got David Rockefeller that allegedly died a year or so ago, and Diddy. And we've got Zbigniew Brzezinski, who allegedly died a year or so ago, and the question is, did he? And we know, many of us know this, that these guys have clones, they have doubles, they, who knows what's going to be what or who is going to be in the coffin, whether it's going to be opened or closed. Some people said, well, it'll be a closed coffin. Well, no, they can do good stuff. If the Tucson Wax Museum can make a perfect likeness, I'm sure they can make a perfect likeness to fit in the coffin. And yes, if you don't let anybody touch it, what's the difference, right? So there's every reason to believe that they may not be dead. And so is he in Gitmo? Is he being ankle monitored? Is he has he been moved to Argentina or to Antarctica or whatever? Who knows? Who knows? But like most of us, see, part of the red pilling, and this is the perfect piece of it, part of the red pilling is that when stuff like this happens, and I see this in many of your comments, is it's darker than we thought it was. There's more going on than we thought. There's still more to dig up. When they tell us something, we don't necessarily believe it's true, and we don't trust anything they tell us. And so when you look at he allegedly died a few hours after he announced that he wasn't going to take any more treatments, many of us either don't believe it or highly question it, and we have good reason. We have really good reason. The fact that Adolf Hitler has been reported to have lived in Argentina and even vacationed in Hawaii for 20 years after World War II puts a point on the fact that nothing that we are told may be true. Nothing may be true. You may legitimately doubt, without being an idiot, tinfoil-hatted conspiracy theorist that follows along with everything. You may legitimately question it, and with good reason. So normally speaking, I would leave this alone, but I have to tell you, this is McCain is endemic to, he's a critical part of the deep dark state and everything that's bad. And there is nothing about it that legitimizes his existence, or certainly having him be in state or awarded with honor, to have died with honor. And so if nothing else, they better clean this up. When we get done with this process of disclosure, McCain should be wiped with infamy. He should be wiped from the process, as should LBJ and FDR and McNamara and all those Georgie Bushy neocons and H.W. Bush and the rest of these guys, that all should be put in sand up to the bottom of their heads and allowed to dry in the sun. So that's my report, and thank you for watching. But it is an angrier report, and yes, I will call him JockStrap McStain, and he is a stain, a blight on this country. Thank you for watching.